The stereotype of the bookworm as this paste-eating, socially awkward loner. But reading improves our social awareness. Reading literature helps us read the room.
This summarizes what we found in that Brain on Google study. So here's your brain reading the book. Here's your brain on Google. More than twofold increase in the extent of activity. Notice how much activity there is in the front part.
Where's the other picture? The reading one. I feel like this does not do reading justice.
Well, on a brain scan, big is not necessarily better.
Hello, babblers, and welcome back to Babblings. If you're watching on video, you can see that we unlocked a new background. I just kind of wanted to record at my desk I'm liking recording at my desk. I do that for when I do the monthly tarot card reading, which is now in the Babblings report, but I do that at my desk and record my thoughts and stuff, and I just have been really liking sitting at my desk. So I figured, let's try this out. Let's, whatever. Let's see how this goes. It's March 17th, and a week ago, it was 70 degrees outside, and today it is full on reaching potential blizzard territory outside, snowing like crazy all day yesterday, all day today. Whatever. We always have false spring, but this is a little intense. And usually false spring isn't like false summer to be so hot. But, climate change, whatever. I'm so happy to be recording. It's been a minute since I recorded a Babblings podcast. I kind of just chilled, accidentally took a step back in February, and just there was just a lot going on. But I've talked about it so much. I talked about it in the Babblings report, and I did a whole blog post about kind of what was going on in my February. So go check that out if you want to. Babblings.net if you're not already watching me there. If you're new to Babblings, welcome. I've been enjoying getting new subscribers. If you have an account on the website, I look at your profile picture and go, oh my God, this person's so cool. So if you have an account and you haven't uploaded a profile picture, please do, because I look at all of them and I love them and they make me happy. I have once again changed my schedule for uploading on Babblings. So right now, the first Friday of the month is going to be the Babblings report, and then the third Friday of the month will be the podcast. I talked more about the updates and why I wanted to do all of that in a little impromptu mini pod episode. It's in the March Babblings report if you're interested and you want to check that out and just kind of hear more about my thought process. If you haven't checked it out yet, the Babblings report, which comes out first Friday of every month, I've been having a lot of fun doing it. There's a monthly collective tarot card reading, movie club where I've been selecting 2 movies. It's not for sure going to always be 2 movies, but it's been kind of flowing that way where I'm pairing 2 movies together. Every month we do movie club, and right now I've been basing the movies kind of off of astrological themes. So if you want to get into that, yeah, check it out. And then I also do seasonal articles, many things, what's going on with me, and then the gossip on my life. And then like I said, the podcast is going to come out every third Friday of the month. It's going to kind of stay how I've gotten it to this point, where it's one dedicated topic and a little bit of current events. And then there will be stuff sprinkled in between. I'm working on a personal essay right now. I'm going to start vlogging. I have a camcorder coming. I had been waiting to pull the trigger, and I finally was let's just go ahead and do it. I've been missing vlogging, and I want to be a little bit more intimate on video and not on the podcast, because I want this to be like a little bit more focused, and then vlogs might be a little bit more intimate and more rambles and like literal rambles and just like what's going on in my life and like life advice. So let's go ahead and get into the episode. We're going to be talking about the literacy crisis. Are people illiterate, or are they just not critical thinkers? But before we get into that, we're going to talk some current events really quickly. I'm just going to take a sip of my tea. It's my mom's tea blend. It's her balanced woman tea, and then also she has a love potion tea. And I mix them together and it's like really fruity and yummy. Like it has like some herbs in it, but also like strawberries and apples and hibiscus. So yummy, so delicious. So, I always do this. I always outline things and then take forever to actually record them. So, of course, the current events that I originally outlined for this episode. Happened a while ago, but I think that they're still important things and things that I actually feel like did not get enough attention in the news cycle. The first thing I want to talk about were the journalists that were arrested. So in February, federal agents arrested Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, both who are independent journalists. The charges were for covering the protests that happened at the church in Minneapolis, and they were released from police custody, but I'm pretty sure they still have ongoing cases and charges that they have to fight against. And why this is something that's like really important, I think, to note, and to kind of, this is like a bullet point on the timeline that we're on, because journalists and media should be protected by the First Amendment. We are a country that has a free press, that is allowed to document things, that's allowed to ask questions, that's allowed to expose things, and they're allowed to do that without interference from the government or from authorities. And I talked about, I think it was earlier in the fall, when the Pentagon took away a bunch of press badges because they like all refused to sign this document that would really like restrict their access and change the way that the press was able to be prosecuted for certain things. And they didn't want to sign that. And so Pete Hesketh was like, okay, bye, and took away their press badges. Not only are both of these people journalists and well-known journalists, but they're also Black. And it's just another example in this administration's long history of trying to censor journalists and news and media and control the narrative, like the authoritarian power that they really are. And this is ongoing. I have an article linked below with the latest updates on what's going on in both cases, what the legal strategy is, and really breaking down for you what they're being charged with, how they could be charged, and how the law can be manipulated in order to charge them. And if they were to lose their cases, it has serious implications for what the government has the ability to do going forward with journalists and media. And it's not even just that, they're censoring TikTok videos. Many TikTokers who post political or news commentary have repeatedly been talking about how they're being censored. Their videos aren't being pushed out. Videos are being taken down. And our own feeds are being censored. I haven't seen anything about Minnesota or Minneapolis, I think probably in a month. And it's like all information that I have to go out and seek for myself, because what's like the ICE raids are still happening. Sorry to like burst anyone's bubble, but the ICE raids are still happening all over the country, and especially they're still terrorizing the citizens of Minneapolis. It's getting really intense in Maine. I'm keeping an eye on what's going on in Springfield. Lots of weird stuff is going on in Ohio, okay, which is not a surprise. There's a lot of like weird money and trafficking things that go on in Ohio. And to have Haitian immigrants being advised to sign away their rights to their children in case they get deported, like to church members, it sounds like a trafficking scheme to me. Sorry. Or like an adoption, like fraud scheme. So, I don't know. we're keeping an eye, but there's a lot going on. And now more than ever, we have to really make an effort to go out and seek information because it's not going to keep showing up on our timelines. And it's going to happen less and less frequently that we're able to just happen upon, really important information or current events going on in the world. And speaking of all of the tragedies happening, because of the immigration crackdown and the ICE raids, I just wanted to bring attention and honor Wael Tarabishi, who passed away earlier this year. He had Pompe disease, and his father was his main and really only caretaker because he needed, 24/7 around the clock care in order to have, a decent quality of life, but then also stay as healthy as he could. And his father was detained by ICE, and shortly after, Wael passed away in a hospital. And his family can directly correlate his father, Mayer, being arrested and detained to Wael's decline in health and then ultimately passing away. Mayer begged and the family begged for him to be able to be released to take care of Wael because he is his main caretaker. And once he passed, they also begged and requested that Mayer be able to go to Wael's funeral. And both of those things were denied. And that is just the complete lack of human empathy, which it's all so tragic. And then him not being able to ultimately say goodbye, it's heartbreaking. And I, just wanted to bring Wael's life, to your attention so that we can remember him, but also because this is an example of kind of what I think are some of the quieter, more insidious things going on besides just the raids or, shooting someone down in the road. People with disabilities are so often disregarded and separated and seen as less than when they're not. Throughout history, there has consistently been a concerted effort to suppress, but then also, remove people with physical or mental disabilities from, public eye and to separate them and to put them in mental institutions or keep them hospitalized or bedridden. And this is just an example of the complete disregard for some of our most vulnerable. And I talked about this when the SNAP benefits were going away. Everybody has this idea, the stereotyped idea of who's getting SNAP benefits and who's getting Medicaid. But taking those away, ultimately, like the first people that impacts are the elderly and the disabled, the people that truly rely on those resources and rely on, in Wael's case, rely on their support system. And it's so tragic. I have some links below for you to read more about their story because there's more to it, and to learn more about Mayer, who I do believe is still detained in an ICE facility. But I think it's just an important story to highlight because the impact of what is going on is so vast, it's so far-reaching, so insidious, and it's a playbook that we've seen over and over and over again. And last thing for Current Events Corner, we definitely have to talk about Iran and the war going on right now between US and Israel versus Iran. So this started on the 28th of February. US and Israel launched attacks onto Iran and ultimately ended up killing the country's supreme leader. And the violence has just continued to escalate since then. As of March 16th, the US-based group Human Rights Activists in Iran reported that 3,099 people had been killed in Iran, including 1,126 military personnel and 1,351 civilians, of which 207 were children. There are investigations going on in the government about whether we had involvement with the bombing of a girls' school in Iran, which Pete Hegseth says, no, we had nothing to do with it, but the evidence obviously suggests otherwise. There's been longstanding tensions between Iran and the US and Israel. And really, this is about resources and land and oil, and it's about imperial power. And while many critiques can be made of the Iranian government in the past 40 years, that in turn doesn't justify us foreigners inserting ourselves into their disputes as a cover for really just wanting to get their land and their oil. And the Iranian government has long been critical of the Israeli government. This is actually the war with the lowest support rate from the United States. I think 1 in 4 people support the war with Iran. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out and how this plays out in a more global context and international allies and enemies. This is really just another case of the US and Israel using the hero facade to insert themselves into conflicts and really upend and destabilize the Middle East, which it's like every few years. This is what they do. So for our main topic today, we're diving into the so-called literacy crisis. So when you hear literacy crisis, what does that mean to you? For me, I had assumed that it meant that we were continuing to have this ever-going problem that Americans just can't read. And on social media, you constantly see the hyper-intellectuals citing the literacy crisis for the reason why people don't understand Calabasas or, more recently, Wuthering Heights. When you look up stats, you'll see things like millions of adults in America are illiterate, or 40% of fourth graders can't read. There's a lot of strong language on how big the problem is and whose fault it is for this problem. Since Bush enacted the No Child Left Behind initiative, which left all the children behind, we've been in this continuous cycle in schools, pushing initiative after initiative, trying to get to the root and solve this problem. But what if the fix is actually creating more gaps and is the root of the problem? Because when I dug and looked into the statistics, you'll find out that 59 million adults have literacy skills at or below level 1, which is the lowest level, which means they can understand very short, simple sentences like reading street signs or understanding the information on a job listing. And 59 million sounds like a lot, but doing the math, that's only around 5% of the population. And when we talk about 40% of fourth graders can't read, well, when you go to the National Assessment of Educational Progress's website and actually look at the statistics, 40% of fourth graders scored below the NAEP basic reading level. Well, then, but what is basic? And as you'll see later in this discussion, who decides what basic is? The NAEP defines basic as a level that denotes partial mastery of prerequisite knowledge and skills that are fundamental for performance at the NAEP proficient level. So what does that mean? And that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't read. Now, being literate is super important. And according to the World Literacy Foundation, low literacy is a major contribution to inequality and increases the likelihood of poor physical and mental health, workplace accidents, misuse of medication, participation in crime, and welfare dependency. One of the interviews I watched was of a police chief in Georgia, and he talked about how one of the largest contributors to someone being detained and put in prison is illiteracy. So it is something to be worried about. It is something to pay attention to and make sure that we're teaching children how to read in order to be functioning adults, which is where the original literacy crisis came from, because people were graduating and then getting to jobs and realizing that they don't don't even have enough of the foundational skills to read a work manual or follow instructions, even at blue-collar jobs. But compared to 50, 60 years ago, we have just continued to increase literacy rates in the United States. I think oftentimes people separate public education from politics when, in fact, every decision that is made for public education is extremely and inherently political, because it's being done by politicians and policymakers. For decades, there's been a silent reading war between scientists and policymakers and curriculum developers about what's the best way to teach children how to read. There are two schools of thought. The first approach is kind of the obvious approach, teaching how to read through phonics. So phonics is teaching children that letters make sounds, and put together, those sounds can create words. And that's how you can learn to read. It's the most literal idea of reading, looking at a word, seeing the letters, putting them together, and understanding what that word is, and then recalling definition in order to read, right? Versus the whole language approach that was started by Horace Mann, where he said, no, we don't need to teach them phonics because it's distracting. His whole philosophy was that we just inherently learn how to read, similar to the way that we just inherently learn how to talk. No one has to necessarily teach us. And I find that that's an interesting concept, because I'm someone that doesn't remember being taught how to read. I remember grammar, and I remember learning, more complex words. But I think I'm one of those people that reading was a skill that I just kind of naturally picked up. And a big part of that was that my life was consumed with books. I constantly had access to learn new things and pick up books and listen to music and become naturally interested in these things, which is how he argues we become better readers. So Mann is basically saying if we surround children with books, they will just naturally become curious and start reading and become better readers. Which, yeah, it sounds perfect in a perfect world. Marie Clay, who is from New Zealand, kind of took the whole language approach and ran with it, creating her own system called 3Qing. When you're teaching someone how to read, you would have seen this. Simple books like Jane Eats Corn, or Josh Sleeps in Bed, or Josh Pets His Cat. And when a child is learning to read and is trying to read that sentence and they come upon a word that they don't know, they're then asked to do 3 questions. What does it start with? What does the picture look like it could say? And also, in context, what would make sense? And then they fill in the word from there. So if you don't know the word cat, say, you can't figure out what this word is, but you see it starts with a C, you know cat starts with a C, you see the picture, it's a cat, the sentence is talking about playing with yarn, that word is cat. And that became Marie Clay's 3Qing method. Lucy Calkins actually recently, in the last couple of years, came under fire for helping create curriculum with different publishers based off this approach and excluding phonics, even though science shows we have to know phonics in order to read, which this emphasis on the whole language approach and not enough emphasis on the phonics approach has led to a concerning problem in which children have been taught how to read incorrectly. And again, that doesn't mean you don't know how to read, but it makes being able to read new things, learn new words, take in more complex information harder to do when you're not taught to read correctly. And this is where I started to form the hypothesis that we're not necessarily in a literacy crisis, we are in a critical thinking crisis. The basic skill of reading is different than the skill of reading comprehension, which again is different from the skill of analyzing or critiquing text. And I don't know about you, but I'm on BookTok where there seems to be this perpetual fight about who's smartest and who's not. And if you read romance books, you're dumb. If you don't read the classics, you're not a good reader, da 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 da. which really is based in a lot of elitist rhetoric because that doesn't take into account the access people have to diverse forms of literature and more complex literature. And also, reading the classics without being able to fully comprehend, analyze, compare to other texts, take in historical context, and break down a writer's intentions, it doesn't really mean anything. You just read the book to read it. Doesn't make you the intellectual that you think you are. So after all this deep diving and researching and hypothesizing, I was still a little confused. Do we use phonics? Do we use whole language? Who's right? Who's wrong? Can the children read or can they not read? So I decided to turn to an expert, my mother. My mom's name is Sarah. She worked in education for over 25 years. As a teacher, she primarily was a reading and language arts teacher to middle schoolers. She was my 6th grade English teacher. She also worked as an instructional coach and was the assistant principal of literacy in DC Public Schools for several years and participated in making curriculum for DC Public Schools as well. Since then, she's also been a principal and superintendent and is here to chat with me about the literacy crisis. How do you teach children to read? Is this something we actually need to be worried about? And how can we address it with the ever-growing larger issue that is artificial intelligence? So here's me and my mommy. Which you're all lucky because me and my mommy have some of the best conversations. And so here's a sneak peek into things we just chat about on the phone. Okay, what is your experience or in your experience, what are the hurdles in teaching kids to read?
I think that changed over time. When I first started teaching, I was a reading teacher, but I was teaching middle school. So I wasn't teaching like foundations of reading. I was teaching literature and grammar. And I started teaching, my first year of teaching was in 2000. And within the first few years of my teaching career, there were a lot of changes in education. No Child Left Behind went into act shortly after I started teaching in those first few years, which brought about the beginning of, I would say it was the beginning of the end, all of the testing requirements. I think initially there were some benefits to it that I personally saw in the school that I was in. I was working in an inner city school in a moderate sized urban area. And it seemed like that brought with it like looking at data and using data for instruction, which was something that I felt was missing in the school that I was working in. But then it very quickly snowballed and turned into just being about testing. And over the course of my 25 years in public education, it just got increasingly overwhelming for teachers to be evaluated on test scores. So you're getting students that, especially at the middle school, right? You're getting students that aren't reading at grade level, or maybe not reading at all. And then being evaluated on their test scores. And that just led to a lot of teacher burnout that's been going on over the last 2 decades. And I would say as a new teacher teaching middle school students that were not strong readers, it was very challenging finding materials and resources to use. It was very difficult to find texts to use with my students that would help them be able to access the text, to be able to comprehend the text, that they could read at their reading level that wasn't written for a 5 to 7-year-old.
Right. So it's their reading level, but it's engaging for their...
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I did spend a lot of time at every school I was at trying to get materials into the classroom that were like high interest, low level readers to be able to work with students. And then I moved from working with primary middle school to working in elementary schools. And as assistant principal of literacy in DC public schools, I really was able to get into like understanding the foundations of reading and where those gaps were happening, and understanding that I was getting kids in middle school that weren't reading at all or weren't reading at the level to be able to comprehend middle school texts, because there's a very short window where those basic foundational skills are taught in kindergarten to second grade. If students don't get it at that point, if they don't understand that letters make sounds and sounds put together make words, if they don't get that by second grade, they're not getting instruction to get that later on. And with the increasing burden of testing and getting your students to be prepared for a test, to take a test and pass a test, it's very counterproductive to getting students to be able to read and learn when you're teaching to a test. And that really has become like what the overarching, I would say, issue is in looking at schools, the way schools are rated and evaluated by states, the way schools within a district are evaluated by the district. When you have, I've worked in schools that had 80% or more of the students not reading at grade level, like 2 or more years below grade level, which is high risk when you're talking about data in schools. And when you have a 5th grader that goes from reading at a 1st grade level to a 3rd grade level, that's huge.
Yeah, right.
That is amazing for the teacher. It's amazing for the child. It's amazing for the family, but it's not celebrated. It's not acknowledged, and you're still failing. That creates, that continued, that continued gap. And I mean, there's so many issues. I think even without testing, and when I look back at my own education before I became an educator, I don't know, I can't identify what I learned in school versus what I learned through life.
Yeah.
So I was raised in a home where there were lots of books, with a mother that loved to read and loved to write and loved to tell stories, make up stories. And it was just like woven into who I was. And when I first started teaching middle school and was working with a student that was having a really hard time understanding a novel that we were reading, I said to her, well, when you read this paragraph, what's the movie you see in your mind? And she looked at me like I had 3 heads, like had no. And then I probably looked at her like she had 3 heads, because I didn't know that everyone didn't see a movie in their mind when they were reading.
Same, right.
So like figuring out like how to do that, I still don't really know how to do that. When I moved and I was teaching in Prince George's County as a middle school reading teacher, the curriculum that we used had a lot of like explicit instruction where we modeled our thinking. And for me, that was a switch in the way that I taught. And so I would, read a story, and as I'm reading out loud to my students that were in 6th and 7th grade, I would stop and say things like, that makes me wonder, what will happen if she makes that decision, right? And like sharing those things out loud with my students, that when I read as a reader, I did naturally in my head. I was always thinking as I was reading and making comparisons to my life, making comparisons to other books that I read, making comparisons to movies that I'd seen. And so sharing that thinking out loud to teach kids how to think critically and how to think creatively is a big part of learning how to read. And so I do think that like the basis of reading is understanding that letters make sounds and sounds make words. And then the part of reading is being able to think critically and think creatively about what you're reading. It's not just, you're not just making the sounds. So after 2nd grade, after, 7, 8 years old, just making the sounds is not really reading. You're reading words, but you're not comprehension. Is not the same as reading the sounds. And kids have to enjoy reading.
Yeah.
I think when I think back to when I was in kindergarten, I can't remember being taught to read.
Same.
do remember in kindergarten, one, that I went to kindergarten for half of a day.
Yeah.
And I remember playing in a big playhouse that was inside the classroom that had like a play kitchen and a play table. And I remember building things with cardboard blocks that looked like bricks. Like, so that's what I remember. And when I think about that and compared to when I was an assistant principal in a school that had a pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 class in it, the things that the pre-K 3 kids were doing were very similar to what I remember doing in kindergarten. With playing, understanding what numbers are, what letters are, using them in ways to count things that are fun or to count things that I like or count things that are the same or count things that are different, matching letters that make, the same sound or things like that. That we're doing with 3-year-olds now and expecting then by the time kids are in kindergarten,
Right.
to be doing things that they're not developmentally ready to do. One of the things that I strongly believe, and there's a lot of research, and a lot of the research is probably older than like in the last 10 years. I've been out of a school setting now for 3 years. So, but whether the research changes or not, I'll never stop believing this, that from kindergarten to 3rd grade, so from like 5 years old to 9 years old, that there's really, unless someone has some type of cognitive disability, or is like exceptional, in any way, whether being exceptionally more advanced than their peers or being less developed than their peers, everyone develops at their own pace, both physically and cognitively. When we take kindergartners and we say that this kindergartner is gifted or this kindergartner has a learning disability, and we're evaluating, it's all subjective, right? It's humans that are doing those evaluations.
Right.
Based on questions that they asked. And so unless there is significant exceptionalism, kids are going to balance out by the time they get to 3rd grade.
Yeah.
And I think we put a lot of labels on kids in those early grades in schools because of state requirements, federal requirements, and what we need to do in schools to get funding for schools to give kids what they need. That holds them back, that holds kids back, that makes school not fun, makes school not engaging.
Well, and I feel like, so talking about, right, you see preschoolers doing what you did in kindergarten. I think some people, to maybe like a public eye, right, that's like, whoa, cool, we got these pre-K, but really it's not, like if a kid can, right, like if a kid can pick that up, then that is amazing, that's great. And me and you also know people specifically that like in those younger years try to like hound in like letters and numbers, and it's like, whoa, let's like play in the mud and like let's have some fun, because then you get to kindergarten and you're expected to be in a place that you really are not there yet, and all of those stages are so important and build upon each other. And like you said, it's subjective and everybody grows at their different pace. You can't force someone to catch up with someone when they're, not ready to do that. And that then, plus what you were saying, where we're not celebrating a 5th grader moving in a school year from a 1st grade reading level to a 3rd grade reading level, combined with like kindergartners not being where they're quote supposed to be at and test scores, like so much of this, I feel like what I've been uncovering is narrative. Like it's a narrative that, kids can't read or they're not doing good or this school is failing because of like these data points, when really, when you zoom in, that's not what's really happening. And I feel like it's almost this form of like fear mongering and turning people against educators and teachers, because those are the people that get a lot of the backlash for that. Like, I think it was important. One of the things you said was this burnout of teachers has been happening for a couple decades, like since you started, like for a couple decades. And a lot of people, I think, will pinpoint to COVID, right? Which was insane.
Mhm.
But these things have been kind of like building up over time. We know someone who taught 50 years ago and loves, to say, oh, I just loved my job and we just had the best times. Well, yeah, girlfriend. That was like things have changed drastically in the last 50 years. So with that like narrative, like when you hear literacy crisis or like the kids can't read, what does that like mean to you?
So I think a couple different things.
Yeah.
There is part of me that's like, yes, there is a problem. There's a problem that kids are not getting what they need and aren't able to express or show knowledge in different areas. But I think you also have to look at like what does that mean? Where's the data coming from? And I know there are larger studies and research that are done that aren't just from state testing, but from my lens, when you look at a school, and gosh, I can't remember what the acronym was now, but when I was an administrator in DC public schools, there was an acronym for the 10 lowest performing schools in the district. And, these schools had all this focus put on them. They were also the highest poverty schools. So like comparing, kids that are hundreds of times time multiplied the poverty line, comparing to kids that were, children of senators, millionaires.
So for my DC people, because I do have DC, like we're talking about comparing kids like in Southeast to North to like school without walls or like kids
to
in
Georgetown and Capitol Hill, right? Which I worked in schools in both areas. I worked on Capitol Hill in a school and I worked in Southeast DC. And what the kids had access to was not the same. Their lives were not the same. Their activities were not the same. But I think also, regardless of where you are, a lot of this idea about the literacy crisis comes from state testing. And as I said, state testing is based on kids being able to read at what someone somewhere, probably not an educator, should be grade level reading.
Right.
Which has also changed just in my time as a public school educator.
Okay.
Lexile levels. So lexile levels, every text is identified with a lexile level. And lexile levels then are correlated to grade level. So, a book that is a lexile level of 1100. And I don't know, I don't remember them. I've kind of erased that from now. But 1100 lexile level might be like 5th or 6th grade. About 10 years into my teaching career, those levels changed. So what we used to say was a 5th grade reading level became a 3rd grade reading level. What was considered, so like the novels that I read with my students. And when I first started teaching those novels 10 years later, I would have been reading those novels with 5th graders instead of 7th graders because someone somewhere said, this is not what is 7th grade reading level. And I do know that, some of that research came from looking at college level texts, professional journals, manuals for any post-secondary careers that didn't require like a 4-year degree, like HVAC manuals or automotive manuals, plumbing, electrician, those types of careers. They didn't align with what we were saying a 12th grade reading level was.
Okay. Right.
So they boosted everything up. So because you need to be able to, to go into this career, you need to be able to read and comprehend this manual or get this degree. You need to be able to read and comprehend these professional journals. You need to be able to do research at this certain level. And then, that boiled down. That at some point had to create a gap, right? If 1 year this was a 5th grade reading level, that's just a fictional number, say 800 Lexile was a fifth
Mhm.
grade level. And then all of a sudden, 1 year later, a fifth grader should be reading at a 1050 Lexile level. Well, that creates a gap.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden, all of these kids that were on grade level
Mhm.
in
Aren't.
fifth grade get to sixth grade, and
Yep.
now they're below grade level.
Right.
And that also affect, we don't take into consideration in education, public education.
Mhm.
A lot of teachers and administrators, the actual educators take it into consideration.
Yeah.
But on a large scale level, a policy doesn't take into consideration anything about children's well-being, their emotional well-being. So as someone that was a high performing student academically, if all of a sudden I went from being above grade level to the next year, someone telling me I was below grade level,
Mhm.
that would have hugely impacted me personally.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't have been okay.
Yeah.
Because of the pressure I put on myself, because of
Right.
the importance that was to me, and maybe not everyone, but I think a lot of kids and parents
Mhm.
who put that pressure on their kids and have a really hard time understanding what it means if my kid's on grade level, not on grade level, making progress, the difference between mastery and growth. There's a lot to understand. And those kind of changes can have a big impact on school staff, on children, on
Yeah.
families when policymakers make these changes. I think that when looking at the literacy crisis, we need to understand what that means.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that make people believe that kids just don't know how to read. If a 10th grader is reading at a fifth grade reading level, they're not illiterate.
Right.
A fifth grade reading level is reading and comprehending pretty complex text, novels, comparing two texts, comparing texts by different authors, understanding the difference between credible texts and non-credible texts. By the fifth grade, kids are learning how to do research, that we don't use just Wikipedia. What is a credible source? And we're learning that in fifth grade. So if you're reading at a fifth grade reading level,
Mhm.
you're not doing too bad.
Right.
And so I think that is something too that not even just the general public, like educators, a lot of educators don't even understand. And a lot of it is because of the pressure being so focused on this narrow thing, test scores.
Mhm.
Like your brain doesn't even have time to comprehend the rest of it or what anything else means.
Mhm.
So, when, and I don't know what the current statistics are. Did you pull any statistics?
So, speaking, like, it's actually very hard to find actual. You kind of talk like you're like, I don't even know where these numbers come from. Well, I read these articles and I watch these videos, and a lot of people throw out these numbers, and then I'm like trying to find where these numbers are coming from, and they're coming from usually like not like actually credible sources. Like, where's the research coming from? Where you go to their website, you can't even pull up like data and charts or whatever. So, but I did find the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They say, based off of test scores, and they say that 40% of fourth graders scored below the NAEP basic reading level. But then I was like, okay, like what is basic? And basic, this level is partial mastery of prerequisite knowledge and skills that are fundamental for performance at the NAEP proficient level. But I'm also like, okay, like, what does that even mean? They're not reading to your level, but like, what even is that level? Which is kind of like what you were talking about, like someone somewhere deciding this is what it should be.
Right. And then that changes, right? It changes
Right.
with who, from year to year or decade to decade, that who gets to make those decisions changes.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I found in education is there's always a new initiative, which is kind of great because there's always research going on. Universities are always doing research around education and reading and math, particularly STEM now also, and trying to identify different things, how we make this better, which each of those things, if someone does some research and comes, states a hypothesis and goes through the whole process and says like, okay, this works, then districts are often like gifted either materials or like human capital as a resource, which is huge. Like there's really nothing more golden in a school than getting people, bodies in a building. And so then these programs come into the schools and they become hyper focused on these programs. And so it's, the saying like, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's like anything that we do, there has to be balance. So when you're looking at teaching kids to read and focusing on phonics, and phonics is important.
This is, one of the things I wanted to talk about was there's the reading wars, which, is not even like an educator thing. It's like a policymakers fighting back and forth. And between, a phonics-based approach versus like the reading recovery, or it's like the 3 Qs. There's an acronym for it, MSV, meaning, syntax, and visual. And like, there's a fight that it has to be one or the other. What do you think about that?
So that's insane, right? It needs to be both. It needs to be all of those things. And you need to be able to adjust that based on the learner. Who is learning this and what do they need? And what do they need in order to grow and learn? Not what do they need to pass a test? Because that's also different.
Yeah.
I can teach a student like test taking skills that might by chance help me just get a few extra points to push me over a line without simultaneously helping that child grow as a learner or as a person or expand their thinking or take on new knowledge. That's not learning to read. That's not learning to show your understanding. So, phonics is important. Phonics is what I said, the basis of understanding that letters make sounds and sounds make words. You have to have that. Or you have to have time to allow it to happen organically. So some of these programs that are like, well, if you can't read this word, look at the picture, right? What word would make sense using the picture? And there's a picture of, a barn in a field and the word starts with the letter C and you're like, it could be cow or it could be camera. You have no idea. Like you don't have the phonics skills to do that. You see the barn, you say cow, right? Because and that's first letter recognition. And that's something that happens with a lot of kids. They know their letter sounds. They don't know how sounds together. So they see a letter that starts with the letter M and they know mom, right? They say the first letter that comes to mind that starts with the M, with that first letter sound. I do believe that we have the innate ability to learn to read, just like we have the innate ability to learn to talk. We aren't explicitly taught how to talk. We hear other people talk and we mimic them. And when we're little, we often say the wrong word. We say a word that doesn't match the meaning of what we're saying. We say a word that we heard someone else say that we shouldn't be saying. We don't know what it means, right? We just heard it. That can happen I believe that can happen with reading. I think there's, a significant amount of research that supports that can happen. It's not going to happen on the same timeline as explicitly teaching phonics.
Right.
So that goes back to also like, I could learn it one way, you could learn it another way. And based on the way that we learn, like how it's taught to us, like based on the strategy used to teach us, and then based on our learning styles, if I'm an audio learner, a visual learner, a hands-on learner, if I need to sit and take time to think and let things process, or if I'm just to like pick it up and go and do it kind of thinker. All those things come into play, but all of those things aren't done in a classroom in a school. So that can make a big difference. And I think it's not like the reading wars. They go together. You use your phonics skills, you use your like deductive thinking skills, use critical thinking, you use creative thinking to be able to read and comprehend text. And reading words and comprehending text are also two different things.
Right.
and they act differently, so even two people being taught the same way in the same setting, and thinking about just kind of like using pictures, using context, using, what do I think or what might make sense? We all have different life experiences that give us different prior knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But depending on where you live, like if you grew up on a farm, you're going to look at the pictures differently and respond differently than if you grew up in a 12-story apartment in the middle of a large city, right? If you have siblings, if you don't have siblings, if you have a big family, a small family, if you live with your extended family, all of those things come into play, that those things build our background knowledge. And so in our background knowledge supports the different ways that we learn and take in information. So I think that that's important to look at. And that's another thing that leads to teacher burnout. Teachers go to school, teachers get degrees, teachers are required to take a certain amount of professional development from year to year to renew their license. They pass tests, they do all of these different things. And then every year are given a new initiative to take in before they even have time to wrap their minds around the initiative that they started last year. Schools also don't give enough time to determine whether or not this initiative actually worked. So by the end of this year, if our test scores didn't magically increase, these teachers are fired, this initiative is gone. We move on to new people, we move on to new products, and we start over. And so that starting over from scratch every year is also a hindrance on student progress.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting you talking about like your background, and like what's going on around you and like all of this like informing how we interpret reading, and then also informing like how we learn to read. And like that first initial idea of like not needing to use phonics, I forget right now what the guy's scientist's name was, but he was like, we don't teach people how to talk. Like, why do we gotta teach people how to read? If we give them enough material, they'll just naturally become inquisitive, and then that makes you a better reader because you are choosing to read and choosing to be interested in it, which is, yes, like kind of like what you were saying, but also though at the same time, and like what you were talking about, we're comparing kids, from Southeast to Northwest, who has the resources to just, and the time to just naturally be curious and teach themselves how to read. Like it's like nice, it's a nice sentiment, but in practice, in reality, it's not as realistic.
Yeah, and I don't think it's even not as realistic in individuals' personal lives. School systems don't allow for that.
Right.
A school system says, when you're 7, you need to do this.
Right.
When you're 12, you need to do this.
Yeah.
When you're 15, you need to do this.
Yeah.
When you're 18, you can graduate and you must be able to do these things to do that, right? Because even in the educational system, you can't stay in high school till you're 25.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like maybe some people need to,
Yeah.
Because the system's not developed to do that. So yes, the resources we have, like our home setting, our lifestyles affect that. But I think the bigger problem is the school system. If the school system allowed for that,
right,
allowed for everyone to get there in their own time, that probably would happen.
Yeah.
But we're killing kids' curiosity.
Yeah.
At the end of kindergarten, it just, it's heartbreaking. Me, myself, as a child, by the time I was in the 4th grade, I knew that school wasn't really doing anything to meet like my needs. I was a very curious child. I wanted to learn new things. And by the 4th grade, I realized I'm going to need to do that on my own. If I was not curious and I was not a strong reader and I was failing, I think by the time I was in 4th grade, I would have given up on school, because essentially I did. And I think that happens to a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And, kids are meant to play. When in the United States, over the years, there's a lot of comparison of like American student to students in China. Uh, and when we look at school systems and then go beyond school systems to like careers and lifestyles and quality of life, when we look at some of these highest performing school systems and places that have the highest quality of life for their adult, they play in school.
Yeah.
They get fresh air. They go outside. I mean, there's research that proves this, not just like woo woo, that you need to have like when we're relaxed. No one ever teaches you that, right? So when you're in a constant state of stress, you're in a constant state of fight or flight. You're not in a position to learn new things. You're just like cruising through. And when you play, when you laugh, when you touch the ground, your body comes into this calmer place where then you're able to take in new information and process it and understand it. And you're in a place where you're enjoying it. You need more than just sitting and having someone tell you information. And that's just not built into our school system. So I think it really comes down to why we have a school system. We have a school system to produce workers.
Right. Yeah.
And to care for children while current workers work.
Right.
It boils down to what is the purpose of education. And
Yeah, and I was just thinking too, it's hard because, you were my 6th grade English teacher. And, I remember you talking about teaching 6th grade in PG County. And that's when you started, you think out loud and like modeling your own like thoughts to teach us how to think. And those are skills, that I still go to today. And, if I think about it, I was never again taught how to do that. So it's like, if you missed that, you missed that, you know? And now as adults, there's this whole thing. I filled you in a little bit about book talk and the drama on book talk and the literacy crisis, and no one has media literacy and all of that stuff anymore. And a lot of people getting offended when sometimes people critique their reading choices, and being like, no, I am a good reader. And like exactly what you said, reading text and comprehending and analyzing text are different skills. And like Frankenstein, I read twice, right? Because the first time, like, it's a complicated text. It's written in basically a different language, back in the 18th century. I compare that kind of text like to reading a fantasy novel where you have to kind of take a while to like reorient yourself into like how the world works and how language works and how interactions and people and characters and all of that stuff. And like read it first just to read it. And then I read it a second time where I could be more analytical and I could stop and say, how does that make me feel? What does that make me think? And I got a totally different understanding and like deeper understanding of the text when I did it the second time. And I feel like sometimes people are almost like defensive to that idea of like, well, I read it, so I get it. You know what I mean? But it's like, well, maybe you read it, but maybe you didn't catch on to that 6th grade lesson of like how to like think deeper about the text. So like you're at a very surface level. And I think would you agree? Like, I feel like that is a bigger problem more than like, obviously there are people that are illiterate and that is a problem. But I also have seen, the amount of people that are illiterate today versus the 80s versus the 50s is very different. It's not the same. Much more people are literate. But maybe also it's too a big difference is being able to go deeper than the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the best things that I ever did in education was when I was trained in reading complex texts. So, and that was after like I had taught in Prince George's County and kind of learned some of these things that aren't natural to everyone and how to model that and help kids that weren't thinking as they were reading learn how to do that. And
It's like a
then-
different muscle in your
yeah,
brain.
it is. Yeah, it is. And then when I was in DC public schools as an instructional coach, and I also wrote curriculum for secondary ELA classes, there was this big focus on comprehending complex text.
Okay.
And a part of comprehending complex text is multiple reads for multiple purposes.
Really?
That was so, yeah. You didn't do any of that in high school?
I actually, now that you say that, I feel like I kind of remember that.
Because you would have been in DC public schools, like when that was happening. It was when I was writing units. So I was on the team that wrote curriculum for complex text. So we did close reading, close, CLOSE, like reading closely, like using a magnifying glass to get into the text. And so multiple reads for multiple purposes. So first you read the text just to get this, like to hear the story, right?
Right.
And then you reread the text, and not always the whole text, depending on what it is. Like a lot of times we taught this using like articles, so shorter text. And then, choosing portions of the text to go back and look at the deeper meaning. One of the things with the close reading of complex text was having like a driving question or an essential question. So someone who already had read the text and understood the text, or the reason why the text was written, right? Developed this question to pose to the students. And it might have been something like, how did the author use symbolism to do something? I don't know. I can't think of anything. And so first you just read the text, right? And then you go back to the paragraphs or the chapters or the sentences that are using symbolism. And then, because that's kind of the driving question, right? And then, like, what is this symbolism? What is the purpose of this symbolism? What is it doing to the text? Or how does this align to the author's purpose, right? And then, and like diving deeper into the text to really understand below just like the surface reading of the text. With novels, like getting into different literary skills that a lot of times people don't understand, like what you were saying. So even a lot of adults, right? Read novels and they don't understand the intention that the author put into that novel. Like that these things were done very intentionally. It wasn't just by coincidence or because the author thought it was cool or it's the way the author thinks, right? That it was very intentional that this character at the beginning of the story and this character at the end of the story were both wearing black pants. Right. Like it wasn't just because black pants are common color of dress pants. Right. So like, and what in between, like what things happened in between to weave those two parts together. Right. So, that's something, that's a different level of reading comprehension. Right. So if I can't do that or I'm not doing that, it doesn't mean that I can't read.
Right.
And if I'm just getting like a basic level understanding, it doesn't mean that I'm illiterate. But by the time I'm in the 10th grade, I'm expected to be able to do these things. And so if I can't do these things on a test, it says that I'm not at grade level for, this many high school students are reading below grade level.
Right.
Which goes back to like what I said. I mean, if you're reading below grade level and you're at a 5th grade reading level, you're a pretty decent reader.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, but, you live your life and read stop signs and read magazines and, like you can interact with the world, Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So there's functional reading.
Yeah.
To like you can read well enough to be able to like move safely through the world.
Yeah.
And accomplish what you need to accomplish.
Yeah.
But that also is that, I would say the greater crisis than the reading crisis is like the comprehension crisis, because that's about critical thinking. And that's about being able to like, even like things people say, it doesn't have to be reading, listening to a song and understanding that like, he didn't say that because it rhymes. Right. He said that because this is what's happening in the world and he's exposing the truth. Right. So like, it's not just, you can do the same thing in text, but if you don't have that ability to think critically, and creatively. And we don't teach kids to think creatively. We teach kids that this is the answer. It's the right answer. Right.
Yeah.
But that's not, I mean, I eventually, it didn't take me long in my teaching career to be like, why am I teaching language arts? It's like so hard to teach and it's so hard to grade because there's not just one answer.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not like math where 2 times 2 is 4.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say it's 5. You can't explain to me how 2 times 2 is 5.
Yeah.
But you could take a text and 4 different people could answer it in 4 different ways. But if they can explain using the text how they came to that conclusion, it's a right answer. But we don't teach things like that. So we're kind of getting away from specifically just being on reading, but into the whole, the larger scheme of education. And that right there, that's what I learned by 4th grade. In 4th grade, I learned I will get an A if I tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
And then after I tell you what you want to hear, I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to get more books on this topic so that I actually I understand it. And is what really led me into education was wanting to be able to teach kids how to think and how to express their thoughts and ideas and to understand that there's more than one way to do things and there's more than one way to understand things.
Yeah.
So my lack of creative teachers is what led me to become a teacher because I felt there's so much more to this than just telling someone what they want to hear. That's not what learning is about. And connecting that to the reading crisis, tests do the same thing. The 3rd grade reading test in Ohio that 3rd graders have to pass in order to go on to 4th grade. And then there's a bunch of things. If they don't pass, they do this or that, or they retest multiple times. It's kind of crazy. But you can teach a kid to pass that test and not teach them how to think. And I think that's really the saddest part.
Yeah.
Is that, you're crushing kids' desire to learn new things, to be creative, to think individually by forcing them to pass a test.
I heard someone say this system isn't broken, the system is working exactly how it was designed. And we talked about that earlier, we're making workers and we're making prisoners, which are still workers. They're just enslaved, so it's hard to have these conversations and this, people they're creating this fear mongering when, really it is the system and all of these kinds of fixes that continue to create gaps. Well, we could talk forever. There's so much stuff you're talking about school. My last thing that I just want to hear from you is what is the importance of reading? What is the importance of not just reading, start there, but then what is the importance of reading complex texts and expanding your reading skills?
So reading is important because that's how we learn things. So in early childhood, we learn how to read. And then as we move into middle childhood and adolescence and adulthood, we read to learn. So it's very challenging to learn new information if you can't read and understand text. I'd even say dangerous. Because if you can't read and understand complex text, other people have a lot of control over you. Because all you have is what other people can tell you. And you're not deducing information on your own.
Yeah.
And that can be dangerous, right? It makes it easily to be manipulated. It makes it easy to be taken advantage of. It makes it easy for you to believe false information. And so I think that comes into even you were saying, with the book talk, if you can't read and comprehend complex text, you're not going to have strong media literacy.
Right.
And the current world that we live in has so much misinformation. And if you can't look at information and have some clues about whether it's reliable or not, whether it's true or it's false. Just like you mentioned earlier, like going to the World Literacy Organization, and it's like it's a .com. Well, anyone can create a .com.
Right.
Does everyone know that? Everyone doesn't know that.
Yeah, not anymore.
Right? Like everyone doesn't know that. Everyone doesn't know that, like when I'm doing research online, I want to look for websites that are .gov, .edu, even better,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Maybe
Not
not .gov anymore. .gov might be dead.
Yeah, .edu is, and looking at research and studies. But then also, like, you have to be able to read that research and those studies.
Yeah.
Because research and data can always be manipulated. You do the research, you can follow the whole scientific process, and then you can present that data in a skewed way that even if your findings don't fully support what you wanted them to be, what your hypothesis was.
Yeah.
You can present it in a way that makes it seem maybe not too far off, right? And then you also have the ability to read and understand complex text, like for enjoyment, expelling your own thinking, like to have something to do that's not going to rot your brain, to be inspired. So, but I do think that, the ability to read and understand complex text is important, which might sound contradictory to me saying that, like, if you can read at a 5th grade level, you're a pretty decent reader. Right. I'd say if you're not, you'll be able to get a job, you'll be able to communicate with other people, but you're not going to have the endless ability to learn new things. So, like, I feel like I had the ability to learn endless things. That I'm 47 years old, and anything new I want to do, I can do it because I have the ability to read and understand complex texts. I would say that, the government, it's more of like a fear-mongering, all of this, like this literacy crisis, right, has a lot to do with creating workers and prisoners.
Right.
Which fuels capitalism. Yeah. And on the other hand, we need people that can read and comprehend complex text so that we don't all get stuck in that space, so that maybe eventually we can move away from a system that only creates workers and prisoners. You have to have people that can read and understand complex text, that can think critically, that can think creatively, communicate those ideas, right? To learn and understand, and then communicate those ideas to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. And then communicate. I feel like that is the other end of reading is language, being able to communicate your thoughts and ideas in a way where other people can receive and understand and break down complex ideas is super important, which comes from being able to understand and read those complex ideas.
Right. And that was one of the things that I mentioned when we were really focusing on close reading of complex texts in DC public schools. It went hand in hand with our writing program, our writing curriculum, and reading complex text helps you become a better writer as well. Some of the things we did, like with students, was give students a complex sentence from a text that they read and give them a question and require them to mimic the style of the complex sentence they were given with their own words. Right. So if it had, like whether it was like using conjunctions or having lists of descriptive words or having a semicolon, or, like modeling that style. So like kind of copying the style, reading the complex text helped them become better writers as well. Because their writing started mimicking their reading.
Well, I even, I have my blog, and then I've been trying to get more into creative writing. And someone once asked me, because I had Substack before I moved to babblings.net, and they were like, do you have a lot of other Substackers that you read? And I was like, there are some people that I read, but I kind of pick and choose because I don't want to start sounding like other people. And which is, I think maybe funny to say, but because then also it's like, well, you can't be a writer if you're not a reader.
Yeah.
And I would say that, but I get so much more inspiration reading Frankenstein or reading A Wrinkle in Time than reading someone's like blog post about incels and fashion. Not saying that like that's not important, but there is just something that creative writing, like, I feel like does for our brains than just like more like nonfiction or like article, or you know what I mean? Like, because we do absorb, you know, a lot of people want to, you know, claim that they were the first to everything. And it's like, no, we all rely within the collective consciousness and we're all pondering the same things. And every time I post a TikTok video about my thoughts and then I see all these other like really cool and hot and smart people saying the same things as me, and I hadn't even watched their video, I've never talked to these people, it's like, yeah, because we're on like the right wavelength, you know. But so, you know, a lot of people want to say like, oh, it's all on my own, but no, like you do absorb what you're reading and your environment, what's around you, and that all informs. And so it's important. My point is, it's important to diversify what you're reading. Especially if you want to be a writer, because it's important to hear different voices and different styles. And then the last thing I wanted to say was like what you were saying about, you know, we need people to be able to do this, because I was watching this TED Talk. She's a literature teacher at a university, and she was just talking about the importance of reading and talking about how there's so many studies that show reading makes you a more empathic person. And like you're able to put yourselves, when you are reading stories about people from different places and different times than you're able to put yourself in those people's shoes. Like, and that is so important too. Like, along with what you're saying, like we need to be able to decode misinformation, to think critically, and to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And that comes from reading.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, I'm trying to think. I don't know if this is my own original thought. Speaking of not having any original thoughts, original thought, or it may be a very famous quote. You know, it's reading allows you to travel to places that you otherwise would have no opportunity to go, right? Yeah. And even today, we have so much more opportunity to travel the world. Mm-hmm. You know, all of you and all of my children have traveled the world more than I have, because it's just so much more accessible now. Yeah. But books, right? Books allow us to travel to the past and to the future, inside other spaces, inside other people's minds, right? Because I've always thought that, like, you know, traveling is so important. Even not even traveling far, like not even traveling like to other countries or other parts of the world, but like to other neighborhoods and communities, to, you know, other, you know, geographic regions within the United States. Understanding that not everyone does everything the same way as you do is so important. And being able to see that people do things differently than you do, and it works well, right? Like they still like they live, like they have good quality of life, or, you know, or don't have a great quality of life. Like understanding those things is so important. And books can take us to places that we might not have an opportunity to go to otherwise. And I think, you know, like when you said that, I was like, wow, like, yeah, like as a child, like the books that I read I read a lot of historical fiction. I think, and then I read a lot of, you know, like biographies and autobiographies and nonfiction. Like history was of big interest to me too. But I think like that historical fiction that I read made me curious. Typically I would read some historical fiction and then I would want to go find the nonfiction that supported that text, right? Like the biographies, the autobiographies, the news articles that supported that, like to have a deeper understanding. Yeah, I mean, that's people that have the ability to understand other people is so important. And as we move further into a world where we're more and more isolated, it becomes more and more difficult to understand other people. And then we're saturated with information, like through social media and all media forms, that either make us feel more isolated and ostracized, or make us feel like, oh, everyone is doing this thing when it's
Right.
not, you know?
Right.
And so having the ability to kind of like sift through that information and gather your own information is super important. And it's becoming more and more challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the world of AI, I think that it's scary
Mhm.
thinking now about all of the college students and high school students using AI to read books to them, to summarize text for them, and then to write essays, to organize their thoughts for them. And, I understand at like a most basic level the intrigue of artificial intelligence and automating, tasks, because that's what we've been conditioned to believe is the best way to live, is to automate, automate, automate. But it makes me worried about this next generation not truly, like maybe truly having an actual literacy crisis, because they can't, without the support of artificial intelligence, read and comprehend and summarize and explain like their not even just text, but their own thoughts,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we had to have faith that there will be people in, this generation that will learn and understand how to use it for beneficially, right? Like for good. Because I feel like, any technology that's ever come about, right?
Yeah.
Has the potential to be used for good or for evil.
Yeah.
And, having faith that there will be people that will learn how to use it like for good and to share that and spread that. So like one thing that like my bigger fear is that like there's going to be a generation of humans that don't know whether or not they're thinking or not, that don't know the difference between whether I created this idea or it was created for me. And so like figuring out how to, so there'll be someone that creates something or does something that makes sure that people know whether or not this is my idea, my thought. Do I really think this and believe this? Or did someone tell me this is what I think and what I believe?
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Thank you so much. This has been such a good conversation. Do you have anything, last words? Anything else?
Oh my goodness. No, I don't think so. I think we
read,
babbled.
kids. Read, kids, and go to the library.
Read. I just, when I was teaching middle school, so yeah, I guess I do have more to say. When I was teaching middle school, and particularly boys, like middle school boys didn't like to read, and parents would be so frustrated. And I'd be like, just let them read what they want to read. Like, so we had this thing at one of the schools I was at, several of the schools I was at, but what I'm particularly thinking about when I was teaching 7th grade reading in Maryland, and it was like a homework assignment to read for 20 minutes a night. And we had like reading logs. Parents had to sign off on them. Like, I don't care what you read whatever you want to read, like, so if your kid loves horses, let them read everything they can find about horses. If your kids love race cars, let them read about how, race car engines or, like, because especially in middle school, right? Because if they're in middle school now, like that has been taken from them. It's been their love of reading has been stolen from them. And so like, that's how you become a better reader. There is research that proves that the number one way to become a better reader is to read. Period. Yes, read. And it doesn't matter what you're reading. Read something that brings you some kind of enjoyment.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't enjoy the process of reading, but you enjoy the topic. And that's like the place to start. And then maybe eventually that will grow, that love of reading. But yes, there's research that proves that the best way to become a better reader is to read.
Thanks for watching.
Oh. Hello, shoulder. Oh. Is that sexy or is that not? Hold on, let's see. Who's calling me? Spam.